was 1880, and the town of Whitaker sat quietly in the folds of the countryside, where dirt roads wound past wide fields, and the nights were so silent you could hear the ticking of a clock from a room away. It was a place where people left their doors unlocked, where families passed each other on the street and tipped their hats in greeting, and where whispers still carried in church pews long after Sunday service. Life here was not fast. It was steady, predictable, and built on routines. But beneath that sense of order, like a thin sheet of glass covering a rotting floor, lay something fragile, something that, once broken, would never be pieced back together. The Whitaker family was well known. Their house rose at the edge of town like a statement of both wealth and distance. It wasn't a mansion by city standards, but it stood tall against the landscape, a house of white stone and dark shutters, with a wide porch that looked out onto the fields. Neighbors would say the Whitakers carried themselves with a kind of superiority, though they never voiced it outright. They were respected for their money, their land, and their ability to command a room without lifting their voice. Yet people also said there was a chill about them, something that left you uneasy even as they smiled. Inside that house, life followed strict rules. The father was a man whose word was law, whose presence filled every corner before he even entered the room. His children were expected to obey, not because they loved him, but because his silence could be heavier than his anger. His wife moved like a shadow, carrying the burden of a woman who had learned early that quietness was survival. And then there was the daughter, bright-eyed, with laughter that tried to cut through the stillness, but always felt like it stopped short, like she wasn't sure if joy was allowed to exist in the home she'd W. As born into fully on the outside, nothing seemed wrong. They attended church every Sunday, their clothes pressed and shoes polished. The father spoke to townsmen about harvests and business, nodding with the air of a man who knew more than he said. The daughter sat beside her mother, quiet but polite, offering soft smiles that drew kind comments from older women who remembered when she was a child running through the grass. To anyone passing by, they looked like a family who had everything: wealth, respect, and order. But those who looked closer, those who had been inside the Whitaker house, noticed things that never reached the town square. The house itself carried an unease. The walls, though spotless, seemed to hold back sound. Laughter died quickly there, like it wasn't welcome to linger. Windows were drawn at odd hours, even when the sun was shining, and it was whispered that no matter how bright the day, the Whitaker home never felt warm. Some said the father's temper was the reason, though few had seen him lose it. It wasn't anger that ruled, but control, a control so sharp it didn't need to raise its voice to make its presence felt. The daughter had grown up, learning to measure her words. She knew when to speak and when silence was safer. She loved her father in the way children often love without choice, but she also feared him. He was the kind of man who didn't need to strike to wound. His disapproval alone was enough to cut deep. Yet she also longed for his approval, for even the smallest sign that he saw her as more than just another extension of himself. She dreamed of things outside the town, of laughter that didn't need to be hushed, of a life where she didn't have to balance every thought before speaking it aloud. There were evenings when she would sit by the window, watching the dirt road that led away from the house, her eyes following travelers who disappeared beyond the horizon. Sometimes she'd press her forehead against the glass, imagining the world beyond, while her father sat in his study, doors shut, a glass of brandy at his side. Those nights carried a quiet tension, the kind that builds not in noise, but in silence stretched too long to eye in town. There were rumors of arguments behind closed doors. Neighbors claimed to have heard shouting carried faintly through the night, though no one dared mention it openly. The father's presence was too strong, his reputation too sharp to cross. And so the whispers remained whispers, tucked into corners of the market, buried beneath small talk. But the unease was there, floating like smoke, hinting that something in the Whitaker household was not what it seemed that IT was in that unease, in that house where silence pressed against the walls and control wrapped itself around every soul inside, that the story began to take shape. A story that would pull the town into darkness, shattering the calm routines they clung to, and leaving behind an image so grotesque it would never leave their minds. A father sitting beside the severed head of his daughter, as if it belonged there. The road to that moment did not come in a single strike. It came slowly, in fragments, through quiet power struggles, through love that turned into control, through respect that soured into fear. The Whitakers' life, so polished on the outside, was a slow unraveling on the inside. And though no one could yet see it, the cracks were spreading, carrying with them the weight of something too heavy to remain hidden for long. The first signs of strain in the Whitaker house appeared in moments so small they almost went unnoticed. A sharp word here, a glance held a little too long, a silence that weighed more heavily than usual. But within the family, these moments weren't small. They were like cracks spreading quietly through glass, threatening to shatter everything if pressed too far. The daughter was growing into herself. At 16, her face had lost the softness of childhood, and she carried herself with a mix of innocence and defiance. She still obeyed her father, but not always with the same unquestioning submission. Sometimes her eyes gave her away before her mouth did. She would look at him with a flash of something, doubt, resistance, or perhaps even contempt, that he caught instantly. He was a man who noticed everything, and to him, those flickers of rebellion were like sparks in dry grass. One evening at dinner, it became clear to everyone in the room. The father was discussing land, speaking with the certainty of a man who believed every word he said carried weight. His daughter interrupted, just a small thing, correcting the name of a neighbor's farm, her voice calm but steady. The table went silent. Her mother froze, eyes darting between them. For a long moment, the father said nothing. He only looked at her. It wasn't anger in his eyes, but something colder, disbelief that she would dare contradict him, even in something so minor. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured, almost gentle, but laced with steel. "Don't speak when you don't know," he said. His words lingered, hanging in the air like smoke. She lowered her gaze, but inside, she felt the sting. She had known. And worse, he knew she had. Moments like these began to multiply. Each time she tested her boundaries, he pushed back harder. The mother tried to soften the blows, smoothing tension with quiet words or hurried distractions. But her efforts were like placing cloth over a growing fire. It could only hold for so long. Beyond the family walls, pressure was mounting too. The Whitakers' wealth, though still intact, had begun to strain. The father's land was productive, but debts lingered, and whispers of failed investments spread quietly among the men he did business with. He hid these troubles well, never admitting weakness in public, but the weight showed in subtle ways. Long hours locked in his study, glasses emptied too quickly, his temper sharpened by the smallest irritation. To a man like him, reputation was everything. The thought of people seeing him falter was unbearable. The daughter, meanwhile, found her world opening in ways her father could not control. Young men in town had begun to notice her, drawn to her quiet beauty, to the way her smile seemed rare enough to feel earned. One, in particular, lingered at the edges of her days. A boy from a family less respected than the Whitakers, but kind and earnest. They shared glances in church, brief conversations in the market, the kind that seemed meaningless to outsiders, but carried volumes for the two of them. To her, he represented something her father never could: freedom. When her father caught wind of this, the unease in the house turned to something sharper. He did not confront her directly at first. Instead, he made comments in passing, warnings dressed as fatherly concern. "You don't know what people want from you," he said one night, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "They'll use you to shame this family." She nodded, as she always did, but inside, resentment was growing. She knew it wasn't about her well-being. It was about control. The mother saw it all unfolding, caught in the middle of two forces she could not balance. She carried her own scars, though few knew them. She had once been young and full of light, too, until years of living under her husband's shadow dulled her. Now she watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and fear. She wanted to protect her, to shield her from the same fate, but she also knew what defiance could cost. Sometimes, late at night, she would whisper warnings in hushed tones, urging her daughter to be careful, to hold her tongue, to avoid provoking him. But the daughter had begun to believe she couldn't live in silence forever. The father, too, carried secrets that tightened the noose around his mind. His control over his family wasn't just about pride. It came from fear that his life, built on appearances and respect, could crumble if anyone saw the truth. There were rumors of an old affair, hushed and half forgotten, that still hung over him like a ghost. He worried it could surface, and every whisper of gossip in town felt like a knife pressed against his throat. The tension in the household reached its peak in ways both subtle and violent. One night, the daughter came home late from the market, her cheeks flushed from laughter she hadn't been able to hide. Her father was waiting in the parlor. He asked no questions, only stared at her until the silence grew unbearable. Then, without raising his voice, he told her she was no longer to leave the house without his permission. It was not a suggestion. It was the law. She felt her chest tighten, her freedom folding into nothing. For the first time, she looked him in the eye and said, "You can't stop me." The words struck him harder than any blow could have. His face didn't change, but something inside him did. From that moment, there was no turning back. The following weeks were filled with small wars. The daughter grew bolder, not out of recklessness, but because she felt she had little left to lose. She found ways to slip out, ways to communicate with the boy in town, each meeting like a rebellion carved out of her father's control. Her defiance was not loud, but it was steady, and it cut him deeper each time. To a man who had built his life on power, on respect that bent others to his will, her disobedience was unbearable. The mother, caught between them, began to unravel. She tried to keep the peace, to shield her daughter from the worst of his wrath, but her own spirit was breaking. She had lived too long under his shadow to believe that escape was possible. And yet, in her daughter, she saw a glimmer of what she had once been, a reminder of the girl she had lost inside herself. The father grew more isolated, his nights spent alone with Brandy, staring into the fire as though it whispered things only he could hear. His thoughts turned dark, circling betrayal, shame, and the fear of losing control. To him, his daughter was no longer a child. She was a threat, a crack in the car. Ethely built image of his life. Every look, every word, every silence between them now carried weight. The air in the house felt heavy, as though something waited to break. And in that charged stillness, in that quiet war of will and defiance, the seeds of tragedy were sown. The town remained blind to the storm inside the Whitaker home. To them, the family still looked intact, their routines unbroken. But behind those white stone walls, every day felt like the tightening of a rope, pulling the father, the daughter, and the mother into a fate that none of them could escape. The breaking point had not yet come, but it was close as a held breath before a scream. And when it arrived, it would not only destroy the family, but leave a mark on the town so deep that whispers of it would linger for generations. The night of the crime did not begin with violence. It began with silence, the kind that hums through the air when a storm is coming, thick and electric. The Whitaker house stood under a black sky, clouds moving heavily over the moon. The lamps in the windows glowed faintly, but inside, the family was scattered across rooms that no longer felt like home. The father sat in his study, a glass of brandy in his hand, the fire flickering shadows across his face. The mother lingered upstairs, pacing the hallway as though she could sense what was about to come. The daughter, defiant even in her fear, had returned late again. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold night air, her hair falling loose around her face. She had seen the boy, the one her father hated, without ever speaking his name. She had laughed with him in the dark, shared words that tasted like freedom. Now, as she stepped through the door, she felt her father's presence before she even saw him. He was waiting, as though he had been sitting there for hours, listening for the sound of the latch. The confrontation began without words. He looked at her, his face calm but unreadable, his hands steady as he set the glass aside. She tried to walk past him, to disappear upstairs, but he rose to his feet, blocking her path. His voice, when it came, was low, heavy with control. "Where have you been?" She hesitated, knowing any answer would cost her. For a moment, she considered lying, but the weight of his stare made it impossible. She told the truth, at least part of it. She had been with friends. He asked which ones. She faltered. That pause was all he needed. The room thickened with tension. He stepped closer, the smell of brandy on his breath, his voice sharper now, accusing, tearing through her excuses until there was nothing left but silence. She tried to stand her ground, her chin lifted, her voice trembling but firm. "You don't own me." It was the moment he had feared, the moment he had dreaded and resented all at once. To him, those words weren't just defiance. They were betrayed. His daughter, his blood, standing against him as though he were the enemy. The mother, hearing the voices rising, hurried down the stairs, her face pale. She tried to intervene, to soothe, but her words dissolved between them like smoke. The daughter turned to her, desperate for support, but the mother's eyes were filled with helplessness. She couldn't save her. Not now. The father's hand shook as he gripped the edge of the table. He wasn't a man of open rage, but something inside him snapped. Years of control, years of bending the world to his will, shattered in an instant. His voice rose, breaking the walls of silence that had long defined him. He shouted words he would never recall, clearly. Accusations, curses, demands. His daughter answered in kind, her voice raw with fear and fury, each word cutting deeper than the last. And then came a moment. It happened faster than thought, faster than reason. His hand went for the heavy tool by the fireplace, an iron poker black with soot. He didn't plan it, not in the sense of careful choice. It was instinct, desperation, madness. The first strike was clumsy, fueled by anger more than precision. The daughter screamed, stumbling back, her hand flying to her head where blood bloomed warm and fast. The scream pierced through the house, a sound so sharp it seemed to split the night itself. The mother rushed forward, but the father swung again, the poker glinting in the firelight. His face was twisted with something between rage and despair, his breath ragged. He was no longer a man in control. He was an animal, striking, lashing out, destroying the very thing he claimed to protect. The daughter's voice broke into sobs, into gasps, into silence. The final blow ended not just her rebellion, but her life. Her body fell heavy against the wooden floor, her eyes wide, staring at nothing. Blood spread across the boards, dark and glistening in the lamplight. The mother screamed then, a sound pulled from the deepest part of her soul. But it was too late. The father stood over the body, the iron poker slipping from his grip and clattering against the floor. His chest heaved, sweat running down his face, his eyes wide in horror at what he had done. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his breathing and the crackle of the fire. Then, slowly, he sank to his knees beside her, high. Hands trembling as he touched her face, as though he could undo it, as though wiping the blood away could bring her back. But death had already settled into the room. The mother collapsed against the wall, her sobs choking her, her body shaking. She couldn't bear to look, and yet she couldn't turn away. The father rocked back and forth, whispering broken words, prayers, apologies, denials. His mind could not hold the reality of what he had done. And then, as though something darker took hold, his grief twisted into something else. He touched her hair, smoothed it back from her face, and sat beside her with a strange calm. The horror of the act blurred into a delusion, an illusion that she was still his, still under his control, even in death. He placed himself beside her, guarding her body as though she were merely asleep. Hours passed in that parlor, the air thick with the smell of blood and smoke. The mother drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind broken, her body too weak to move. The father did not leave his daughter's side. At some point, in a haze of madness, he did something so grotesque it would stain his name forever. He separated her head from her body, as though by holding it close he could keep some part of her with him. When the neighbors later forced their way into the house, drawn by the silence and the unanswered knocks, they found the scene burned into memory. The daughter's body lay sprawled on the floor, blood dried black around her. The mother was slumped nearby, barely conscious, her eyes hollow with shock. And the father, he sat in his chair, his daughter's severed head resting beside him, his hand on it as though it were a beloved possession. His face was vacant, his eyes unfocused, lost somewhere beyond reason. The parlor was no longer a room but a tomb, a place where love, fear, and control had collided and destroyed everything. The crime had unfolded not as a sudden act of rage, nor as a carefully plotted murder, but as the breaking point of years of silence, power, and fear. And in its aftermath, the town of Whitaker would never be the same. The days after the crime hung over Whitaker like a cloud that refused to move. What had once been a town of quiet routines now pulsed with whispers, suspicion, and fear. The Whitaker home, once admired for its size and presence, became a place people crossed the street to avoid. Even before the newspapers carried the story, the horror of what had happened spread from mouth to mouth, each telling darker, heavier, until the truth itself felt too unbearable to face. The father was taken from the house in a daze, his hands still trembling, his eyes hollow and distant. He offered no resistance when the sheriff's men arrived, no denial, no defense. He was found sitting where the neighbors had discovered him, his hand resting on the severed head of his daughter, as though he were cradling a part of her still alive. When questioned, his answers came slowly, broken, his voice unsteady. Sometimes he spoke of love, sometimes of betrayal, and at times he seemed not to know what he had done at all. There was no single explanation, only fragments of madness and control tangled into something too twisted to untangle. The mother survived, though she was never the same. She was carried from the house in a near catatonic state, her face pale, her eyes fixed on some point no one else could see. In the weeks that followed, she drifted through each day like a ghost, her words few, her body frail. Neighbors brought her food, tried to comfort her, but nothing reached her. She had lived too long under his shadow, and now that shadow had swallowed her whole. Some pitied her, others blamed her, whispering that she should have spoken out sooner, should have found a way to stop him. But most simply avoided her, unable to look at her without remembering the horror she had endured. The daughter's funeral drew nearly the entire town. The church was heavy with silence, the coffin closed, the pastor's voice breaking as he spoke of innocence and loss. Women wept openly, men bowed their heads in shame. Many struggled to reconcile the girl they remembered, the polite child with quiet smiles, with the brutal image of her end. For weeks afterward, her name was spoken with a kind of reverence, as though to say it too loudly would disturb her rest. Yet in hushed tones, people wondered if her spirit could truly rest at all, given the way she had been taken. The trial of the father began swiftly, but it carried no suspense. He was guilty, everyone knew it. The question was not what he had done, but why. The courtroom filled each day with townspeople straining to hear, to see, to understand what could drive a man to destroy his own blood in such a way. The prosecution painted him as a monster, a tyrant who had ruled his family through fear until his control snapped. The defense spoke of madness, of a mind broken under the weight of pride, fear, and drink. When he stood before the judge, the father did not plead. His voice, low and unsteady, carried through the room as he admitted to the act. Yet even in confession, he could not let go of control. He spoke of betrayal, of a daughter who had defied him, of a family slipping from his grasp. His words chilled the room. To him, even in the face of justice, she was not a victim but a rebel. And in that twisted view, he found a kind of justification, as though his crime had been less a choice and more an inevitability. The jury deliberated briefly. The verdict was clear, guilty of murder. His sentence was to hang. The town waited for the day with a mix of dread and grim satisfaction. Some wanted him punished swiftly to erase the stain he had left on them. Others feared the execution would only deepen the darkness, too, running him into a figure of legend, His crime whispered about long after his body was gone. As the gallows were prepared, the father remained largely silent. He ate little, spoke less, his mind slipping further into fragments. Some who visited him in jail said he spoke to his daughter as though she were there beside him, his words tender one moment and bitter the next. To the end, he seemed caught between love and hatred, unable to reconcile that the same girl he had once cradled as an infant was the one he had destroyed. The mother did not attend the hanging. She could not bear to see him again, nor could she watch the town cheer the justice they believed was theirs. She withdrew deeper into herself, her days spent in silence, her nights haunted by screams she could not forget. To many, she became a figure of tragedy, a living reminder of what had been lost. For the town of Whitaker, the crime left scars that outlived the people themselves. Neighbors who had once admired the family now spoke of them only in hushed tones. The Whitaker name, once a mark of wealth and respect, became a curse. Children were warned not to wander near the house, not to speak the name aloud after dark. Some claimed the daughter's spirit lingered, her laughter heard in the fields, her cries in the night. Whether superstition or truth, it was enough to keep the town uneasy. The newspapers carried the story beyond Whitaker, painting it as both scandal and warning. Some articles spoke of madness, others of pride, others still of the dangers of unchecked power in a man who ruled his family like a kingdom. Each retelling reshaped the story, but at its heart was always the same image: a father sitting beside his daughter's severed head, as though love and control had twisted into something unrecognizable. Time moved on, as it always does, but the memory did not fade. For those who lived through it, the Whitaker crime was not just a tragedy. It was a mirror held up to the fragility of their own lives. It forced them to question the families they thought they knew, the men they respected, the silence they ignored. And in those questions, a darker truth lingered, that behind closed doors, even in the quietest towns, horrors can take root unseen until it is too late. The aftermath left no true healing. There was only survival. The mother survived in body, but not in spirit. The town survived in name, but not in innocence. And the father, he survived only long enough to face the rope, his final moments watched by the same people who once nodded to him with respect on the street. In the end, all that remained was the story, passed down in whispers, retold in fear. The tale of the Whitakers became less about wealth, less about reputation, and more about the danger of silence, of control unchecked, of love twisted into ownership. It was a reminder that even the strongest stone walls cannot hold back the darkness that grows within them. The crime's conclusion left scars that could never fully heal. Legally, justice was pursued, arrests were made, trials held, and sentences delivered. But even as the gavel struck, a sense of incompleteness hung in the air. Some of those involved bore the weight of guilt, breaking under the pressure of remorse, while others clung to denial, justifying their actions as if rewriting the past could cleanse them. Families were fractured beyond repair. Reputations that once commanded respect were destroyed overnight, and futures that had seemed bright now lay in ruins. The antagonist, once consumed by arrogance and control, was stripped bare before the public, forced to confront the consequences of choices driven by jealousy and obsession. Secondary figures, who once played smaller but pivotal roles, wrestled with their own shame, whether by enabling, ignoring, or being complicit in the escalating tensions. Survivors and bystanders alike carried the trauma forward, their lives forever shaped by the haunting memory of what unfolded. Beyond the courtroom and family circles, the crime's impact rippled outward into society. The media sensationalized every detail, painting the tragedy into headlines that divided the public. Some saw a cautionary tale of unchecked passion, while others condemned institutions for failing to intervene sooner. Social media ignited debates about morality, justice, and power, turning the crime into a cultural reference point for discussions about secrecy, manipulation, and control. The case spurred calls for reform, stricter laws, greater accountability, and new safety measures designed to prevent such tragedies from repeating. Yet even these changes could not erase the collective unease. Communities beyond the immediate one studied the story as if holding a mirror to themselves, questioning the fragile trust within their own relationships. At its heart, the case revealed the complexity of human nature, the blurred line between victim and villain, the danger of buried grievances, and the destructive power of jealousy when left to fester. While the legal system provided closure on paper, true justice remained elusive, as the loss endured by loved ones could never be fully repaired. The conclusion left behind lingering questions about morality, control, and the fragile balance of human behavior, urging reflection on the shadows that dwell within us all.